Hello everyone, welcome to Wildwood Studio. I'm Sarah, and in this video, I'm going to be doing a wood burning of an owl. For this burning, I used the largest panel that I have, which is 16 by 20 inches. That size may not seem that big, but since I normally work somewhere around 6 by 8 or 8 by 10 inches, that was pretty daunting for me. Also, this one was a project that I was doing for my boss, so no pressure there either. The dragon I did a few years ago was also on a panel this size, but since the background on that one was plain black and this one is much more detailed, it was a lot more complicated. This burning is on basswood and I used my Razortip SSD10 wood burner. The first step, as always, was to sand my wood panel. I've heard people say that they're tempted to skip this step, but sanding the wood smooth first will make the rest of the burning a lot easier. It helps with shading and it leads to a much better finish. After sanding, I transferred the owl onto the wood, making sure to outline all the main areas of shading to make my life easier later. I did this in pencil, which needs to be done very lightly since pencil doesn't erase off of unfinished wood as well as you might think. This is why I don't usually sketch directly onto the wood and I prefer to use transfer paper instead. I started off with the owl's eyes and face because that's where I get to see the most progress the fastest. I went around the eyes using the edge of my spoon shader pen and filled in the pupils, then I did some of the feathers right up next to the eyes. But I made sure to leave a little white space all the way around each eye. This is because the feathers are quite dark there and I wanted to make sure the eyes still pop and don't blend in with the feathers. Also, the reference does have a bit of a highlight there as well, maybe just not as bright as I made it. This is something that I think a lot of beginners could try since I've seen burnings where everything is very dark and it's hard to differentiate one object from another or the subject from the background. But if you leave a little highlight or a rim light between things, it can help make them stand out and make sure they're readable. Next I moved on to his beak, which is very dark and surrounded by light feathers, so I worked the feather texture around the beak first and then shaded the dark beak, making sure to leave negative space for the highlights, which helps to communicate the smooth texture. This owl has a fairly complicated feather texture, so it was mostly a matter of filling in the darker feathers and creating the feathered texture at the edges of the lighter feathers. I did this with my spoon shader by using short strokes and leaning on the edge of the spoon, and I varied the tone by changing the speed at which I moved the pen. So to make a line that starts out dark and turns light, I start slow and then flick up at the end, and this also gives the mark a nice point since more of the pen tip is on the wood at the beginning than the end of the stroke. The reference I had for this wasn't the clearest when I zoomed in at this large size, so I also used some other pictures of this type of owl to help me see the texture on the feathers more clearly so that I could draw it better. Most of the feathers on his face are much lighter than the surrounding ones, and also have a different texture than the feathers on the body and the head of the owl, so this area had much longer pen strokes to communicate that texture. In wood burning, you can only burn darker and never lighter, so I had to leave a lot more negative space on his face, but I did come back to that area in the end and add some more shading. The texture on the rest of his head is much tighter with smaller feathers. This feather pattern also curves differently than the face, angling with the curve of his head. It's always really important to make sure the pen strokes go in the right direction, so the dark areas are shaded with the curve of the head and the body in mind. Even if an area seems completely black, this will sometimes still read, so it's better safe than sorry. Having pen strokes that are straight across and don't follow the proper direction of the feathers will really flatten a piece and keep it from looking realistic. I was planning to add color to this burning to emphasize the yellow eyes and white highlights around the face and throughout his body, so I kept that in mind while I was burning this area. The owl's chest and body are where the feathers started to lengthen and the pattern got a little more spread out again, so the light and dark areas are larger than the feathers on his head. This area also had some cast shadows created by the wings and under the legs, so these areas are an opportunity to create more depth and make the owl look three-dimensional. I don't think I've shown this in any of my other videos, but you can see me using a reference on my phone here. When I'm burning, I always have my reference in front of me and refer back to it constantly. I was looking in the comments of someone else's drawing tutorial recently, and someone mentioned that they didn't know why a grid helped them draw so much more realistically than when they weren't using one. And I think there's a few reasons for this. It gives you a point of reference for where sections of the image start and stop, but I also think it forces you to really look at the reference photo you're using. This is something my high school art teacher was always saying whenever we do life drawing. He'd constantly remind us we need to look at the model just as much, if not more, than we're looking at our art. Otherwise, it's way too easy to get carried away with drawing and forget to check the reference. The feathers on the wings are much darker than the ones on the belly, so I worked at a slightly higher temperature in this area. Temperature is another thing I'm constantly adjusting, so there's no set number, but when I'm burning a darker area, I find the pen cools down a bit more while I'm working and needs to be turned up hotter to get the same tones. I think it's just because in areas with darker shading, the pen spends more time in contact with the wood and transfers more heat to it. The light sections here are smaller and mostly outline the feathers, and these feathers also have white tips, so that was left as negative space as well. With the darker areas, it was a bit like drawing backwards because I had to fill in the shapes and then leave the outlines white to keep the definition between the feathers. At this point, it was time to move on to the background, and I used my spoon shader pen for pretty much the whole background as well. This owl is sitting on the ground in the tall grass. The original picture is very much all browns and beiges, so this translated pretty well to the burning. I would say this was much more complicated than just burning the background dark, but maybe still less time consuming, and it didn't turn my fingers orange, which sometimes happens when I burn for a long time at a really high heat. This might be the first time I've done a full realistic background, so that was a little daunting, and I was really happy with how it turned out in the end. Honestly, when the person I was making this for told me he wanted the whole background to be realistic, I was kind of like, oh, crap. Because it was a lot of work and it made me sort of nervous that it wouldn't turn out right, since I generally just do the subject of the picture and leave the background blank or burn it dark, which I guess is kind of a cop-out now that I think of it. But I really like how this turned out, so I'm really glad he asked me to do it this way. Because of how much larger this burning was than the reference image, I did have to make up some of the background and fill in how the grass and twigs overlap. This is because the photo didn't blow up very clearly at this size. This happens a lot because it's uncommon to get a reference that blows up cleanly to the size that I'm trying to burn it. One thing that was difficult about this background is how different parts are in or out of focus. So you can probably see that some of the grass and twigs I put in are very clearly defined, so when you look at them you can tell exactly what they are. And that's mostly the case for the ones that are closer to the camera and closer to the owl. But the areas that are further back are more blurred with less detail and come across more as shapes and shadows that suggest grass. Another challenge with this background was keeping it all looking the same. Since it took me so long to finish the background, it was sort of difficult to maintain the same techniques across the whole thing and not have it gradually change from one side to the other and become overall darker or lighter or more or less detailed. This is just because there are a lot of different ways to communicate the same image, so I had to make sure that the whole burning looked cohesive in the end, and I ended up going over a lot of different areas to make them darker and add detail and texture, and just make sure that everything matched. I did go a bit too far with the shading in this area. Probably no one would notice but me, but I ended up sanding some of that off with a bit of sandpaper to make it lighter. Once I had finished with the background, I felt like the owl's face was too light for the rest of his body and the burning looked a little unbalanced. so I went back over it and added more texture and darkened the shading in that area. After I finished burning the owl, I added some color. For this, I used my Derwent watercolor pencils, basically just a mix of yellow and orange and white for the eyes, and white for the highlights and the white feathers on the owl's face and body. The watercolor pencils are great for this because I can color with the pencils and then smooth it out with the water and just go back and forth with this with the pencils and the brush until I get the look that I want. As always, it's important to add any color after the burning is complete because you don't want to be burning paints or pencils or markers, since these things can be toxic to burn. This also goes for any wood finish. You don't want to apply a wood finish until you're completely finished burning. The last step was to clear coat this. I used my Varathane Diamond wood finish. I also decided since I spent so much time on this burning, I would try having it scanned, so I paid a company in Toronto called Colorgenics Fine Art Imaging to scan this burning before I gave it to its new owner. I'm pretty happy with how the scan turned out, so I might take more work to them in the future, especially if I want to make prints. So here's the scan of the finished burning. As always, please let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want to see more of my work, you can check out my Facebook page or follow me on Instagram. Also, please make sure to like this video if you haven't already, and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss all my future art videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.